So I've got a pretty nice gaming PC, but the thing is, it's exactly that. It's a gaming PC. A lot of the computers people use aren't used for gaming. When we think powerful computers, gaming is one of the first things that comes to mind. But there are so many other uses, and I'd argue the majority of computers that are out there aren't used for gaming. So what if you're something like an office worker or a student, and you don't necessarily want a laptop, but you want a good desktop PC to get what you want to get done? What are your options? Now, one of the most popular options, ever, is a Dell Optiplex. This is a Dell Optiplex, small form factor build. It is an Optiplex 3060, 2 USBs, 2 USB 3.0s. Even though it's got the slot, I don't believe it's got a disk drive or an SD card slot. Integrated graphics, no graphics cards, and very basic I/O on the back. But this doesn't need to run powerful games, this has just got to get your work done. And for context, I got this from a local business for absolutely free as they were e-wasting them and replacing them with new ones. So this was used up until very recently. And a lot of people I talked to have heard of a Dell Optiplex or used a Dell Optiplex. But I want to ask, are they a good option? Should you be buying Dell Optiplexes, or are there better options out there? Now, just for a bit of a framing, I've been looking at similar computers, and refurbished, they usually go for about $250, which is pretty cheap for a computer. Brand new, it would be much more than that. But you know what? I'll give the Optiplex the advantage. To play on the safe side, I'm going to assume about $250 for a PC of this strength. I haven't booted it up yet, but as far as I'm aware, it's a Core i3 8th gen, as I don't think it would have been upgraded. I'm going to guess 8 gigs of DDR4, but probably only single DIMM, as it's a pre-built. So what I want to do is, before I boot it up, I want to open it up, have a look inside, and point out a few things that I know about Optiplexes on the inside. This is the Dell Optiplex 3060 on the inside. Now, there's one major difference between this Optiplex and some other Optiplex. These small form factor ones are very common in things like businesses and stuff, but I personally don't like them nearly as much as the standard tower. Dell Optiplexes have standard tower versions, and the benefit to them is that they're standard ATX. You can chuck in practically any parts, any upgrades, and any repairs that you need to do. A machine like this is not. None of the mounting screws are in the right place for it to be ATX. The power supply most certainly is not ATX. And the power supply isn't even outputting to a 24 pin, or even a 20 pin at that. I believe it's got a standard CPU socket, which is good, even though it's got the fan that blows out the back. And on top of all that, while it has SATA power, that SATA power is coming from the motherboard, not the power supply. These small form factor Dell Optiplexes, nothing is standard about them, which makes it a lot harder to repair them or change anything on them. Especially with things like low profile graphics cards, which while do exist, are harder to find, especially single slot ones, because there's only one slot of wiggle room on this PC. Now, I don't plan to do a full teardown, not until I've powered it on and tested. I have pulled out the RAM. There's only one stick, as I predicted, and it does say 8GB on it, so it looks like I was right about that. DDR4. There's also the SSD in there, which seems like it's 256GB. A SATA M.2 SSD, as you can see by the keying. Another interesting thing is, while we do have the back I.O. over here, I also noticed that this 3.0 header wasn't being used, even though it had it on the front I.O. That is because the front I.O. is just on the motherboard, because the motherboard just spans the entire computer. And so while they do a few things right, like they've got extra drive sleds here, extra drives and stuff could be added, and they do help you a little bit with repair, as on this fan here, I don't know how well it's turning out on camera. They do have assembly guides if you want to change things in the machine, but almost every part you'd have to buy through them. There's nothing standard. And so I'm going to now go reinstall Windows, as it requires a wipe, and get it up and running, so that way we can do some testing and benchmarking on it. While I did say not every computer is a gaming PC, I'm going to run some games on it for the sake of benchmarking, for a frame of reference, as well as run the test 3D mark just to get some definitive numbers. So let's get this running. This is one thing Dell's usually pretty good at. Pre-builts are usually notorious for having a pretty locked down BIOS. Like this Acer one I was working on a few videos ago, needed a lot of steps just to get Windows downloaded. But from my experience at least, Dell seems like it's pretty good with BIOS and stuff. Though one thing to note with this BIOS though, it's 8th gen, and while the motherboard chipset is, I think, the Q370, which is compatible with 9th gen, there is not a BIOS up for it anywhere for the 3060 here, which is one thing to consider. That tends to happen a lot with pre-builds over custom builds, and so while Dell does release BIOS updates, it just doesn't have one for 9th gen. Okay, I've got Task Manager up and running. It's got an i3 8th gen, 4 cores, 4 threads, 3.6 GHz, 8 gigs of DDR4 memory, M.2 SATA SSD, Intel UHD graphics 630, pretty good, DirectX 12, that's all pretty good, and is all up and running properly. All the specs we kind of expected, so I'm going to start running a few benchmarks. I've got 3D Markup, which is a benchmarking tool, and I'm going to be running 3 benchmarks: Night Raid, CPU profile, and time spy. I'm going to run them all and then give you the results. After that, we'll do some benchmarking on a few games. So let's start with Night Raid. So these are our results for Night Raid. Not a bad score. Let's run time spy. Here's our score from time spy. Graphics score is a lot lower than CPU score, which is interesting, and I'll talk about later. Then here we've got the CPU profile score. It's a pretty good score for a CPU. So those are all the benchmarks run. So next, I'm going to go run a few games. So a game like the original Doom, which is by no means hard to run, is running at about 105 FPS, which is not bad. I've seen faster, but it's certainly not bad. Got Half-Life 2 running, but that's only running at 60 FPS, but that's an engine thing. I've never been able to get it much above that. But the CPU is only at like 19%, which means it's running it easily. Here we've got Portal 2 running quite easily. 50 FPS, which isn't great, all things considered. I've seen higher. It's not bad by any means. I've got a game like Dead by Daylight running, and it is running at like 5 FPS. It's not running well. And then a game like Assassin's Creed Unity is running at a total of 5 FPS. So looking at this Dell Optiplex, with the question of should you buy it is an interesting question. There are two options for this. Number one is the average business and school consumer, in which I say yes. Especially if you're buying them refurbished, they're cheap, they're pretty good, they get the job done. And the fact is, unless you're going to things like AI and stuff like, and an AI type workload, and which in reality you're probably going to have something stronger than a Dell Optiplex anyway, you don't need a graphics card. Really, a powerful CPU and half-decent RAM is all you need for that office-type workload, which is what this has got. It doesn't need anything past that. So if you are a student, or you're buying computers for your office, your small business or whatever, and you see some cheap Dell Optiplexes, check the specs, because some of them are quite old, admittedly. And if you get an older one, it might be a different story. It might just not be that powerful. But if you're buying a half-recent Dell Optiplex, even though this is an 8th gen i3, it's a pretty good CPU. If you're just doing school or office work on it, it'll do the trick perfectly. But if we're asking the question for something like a cheap budget gaming PC or something along those lines, the answer is a bit different, because the answer is kind of. This is a good baseline, in my opinion. It's already got a good CPU, it's got a power supply. If you see one of these cheap and you're just starting to get into PC building, you're not comfortable fully custom building yet, something like this is a good option with modification. Like what I would do is chuck in a low profile graphics card, and if you want to get a little bit crazy with it, chuck in some RAM like this DDR4 Corsair Vengeance. The RAM's already half decent, the CPU score's already half decent, which is like halfway to a gaming machine. The main aspects of a gaming machine are the CPU and the graphics card. And so if you're looking for a budget gaming machine and you're not comfortable custom building, because I will say you can probably custom build something a little bit stronger than this, unless you get a really good deal on a refurbished one, and your upgrade path is limited with something like this, which is the only thing with gaming. But what I'm going to do to prove that point is chuck in a graphics card, chuck in some RAM, show you how easy it is to do that. So let's chuck it all in. The first thing we're going to have to do is break out that bracket, which is quite literally just folding it out. So I'm chucking in what I've got on hand. This is this simple, I'm doing it already. With that simple little process, I've already installed a graphics card, but you can find pretty powerful low profile ones. The only problem is, yeah, because it's not necessarily intended to be a gaming machine, you need to find a one slot one as well. I do have a GTX 1050 Ti that I could have put in, but it's dual slot and would not fit. Then DDR4 RAM. Quite literally is just two clips, you slot it out, you slot the new one in. As simple as that. I've got both sticks of DDR4 in and a graphics card in. I'd like to emphasize that is all I've switched in. I'm now going to make sure it's still boot. The Dell Optiplex is all plugged in and is running. Slight BIOS issue though. All it's going to take is a quick setup, then we'll be good to go. So the RAM is registered, but the only thing is it's not running at its designated speed, which is something I've got to fix in the BIOS. I should be able to do that though, because as I said, the BIOS isn't too locked down. And here we've got the Dell Optiplex BIOS. Now look, it's a little bit more locked down than a standard BIOS would be, but it should have enough in here, but it's a bit more confusing. We should be able to reset our RAM. Never mind, I've just found something very interesting. I've been praising this Dell Optiplex for being repairable, but, well, nothing's perfect. After some research, apparently a lot of Dell Optiplexes cannot enable XMP. There is no XMP settings here, and so with this RAM, though, admittedly, there are plenty of RAM options if you wanted RAM that was 3200 megahertz, still 16 gigs, and didn't need XMP. There still are options. Most of them are a bit slower, but it's not like you're completely out of luck. I've got my cat next to my PC now. TLDR, for school and office workers, I don't even think it needs major mods. If you're using a half decent one, it's going to run fine. It's going to run most of your applications. And if you're going to be doing something higher tier like AI or massive amounts of computing, you're probably not looking at Optiplexes in the first place. And for something like gaming, you can definitely make an Optiplex into a half-decent gaming PC, but you've got to be very careful about how you do it, because it can go wrong very fast. So make sure you understand the Optiplex you want to buy, do a bunch of research, and if you're going to buy Optiplexes, I definitely recommend secondhand, because after businesses get rid of them, they go into the market and just absolutely and utterly flood it. Anyway, I hope this video was useful for you and helped you decide whether you should buy a Dell Optiplex. They're an interesting line of PCs, and I feel like everyone's heard of them, but a surprising lack of people have really had hands-on with them. The enthusiasts have all the enthusiasts look them over because they're just custom building, and anyone who's not an enthusiast is probably not interested enough to understand what an Optiplex really is. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, as I'm a small channel, and help out a ton. Comment what you do your school or work on, like what the specs are, what the model number is. I'm curious what people use. And you can click one of the buttons on screen to find another video. But, well, bye-bye.